Hi, Mr. Juarez. How are you today?
Well, how are you?
Good, thank you. All right. I'm collecting information about Lucia's behavior because she has been referred for a functional behavioral assessment. Since you are Lucia's case manager and special day class teacher, she spends the majority of the school day with you, right?
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you for setting aside time for today's interview. It'll take about 30 minutes.
No problem.
Okay, good. We'll start the interview with a routines analysis. Can you please describe Lucia's day in general, the time of day, the activity, and the staff involved?
Sure. From 8 to 8:15 in the morning, she has breakfast in school, check-in with my instructional assistant, Mrs. P. From 8:15 to 9 o'clock in the morning, we do morning work in my special day classroom, daily check-in with a filling paper, morning meetings, flag salute, and etc. The next big block of time is English language, arts rotating groups in my SDC room. From 9 in the morning to 9:30, rotation number 1, computer work related to reading and writing with Mrs. P. My instructional assistant supervises the computer and independent work groups.
Okay.
From 9:30 to 10 in the morning, rotation number 2, Lucia is in a small group with me for reading and writing. From 10 to 10:30 in the morning, rotation number 3, Lucia is completing independent work related to ELA. From 10:30 to 10:45 is recess time. From 10:45 to 11 in the morning, students return to my classroom for their time, independent reading with a library book of choice. From 11 to 12:20 p.m., students work in rotating math groups in my SDC classroom. Their rotations are similar to ELA groups. From 12:20 to 1 o'clock p.m., lunch and recess with staff supervisors. From 1 to 1:30 p.m., the students go to general education, PE, with Mrs. L. From 1:30 to 2:25 p.m., the students return to my SDC class for science, art, or history. We rotate through the subjects each week or complete interdisciplinary projects. From 2:25 to 2:40 p.m., dismissal. Students clean up and get ready to leave for the day.
Okay, thank you so much for that detailed breakdown of Lucia's typical school day. Now we'll look at each period throughout the day. And then for each period, can you rate the likelihood that Lucia will have the problem behaviors using a scale from 1 to 6, with 1 being almost no likelihood of problem behavior and 6 being a very high probability? Can you start by rating morning work and daily check-in?
Well, I rate morning work as a 2.
Okay.
There is a low likelihood that Lucia will be disruptive.
Okay, great. How about ELA rotation number 1, computer work?
This will be a 3. There are times she will say inappropriate things to other students.
Okay, can you describe what you mean by inappropriate things?
Well, she will address other students with some phrases such as "you," "s," or "don't look at me."
Okay, are there any interventions in place?
Modeling of appropriate behaviors. Mrs. B, my instructional assistant, will remind Lucia to keep her eyes on the computer and ignore other students if they are looking at her.
Okay, great. How would you rate rotation number 2, small group reading and writing with you?
Well, this is when her behavior is the most challenging. I would rate her a 6.
Okay, since you rated her a 6, I need to complete the next 2 columns. Briefly describe the behaviors you observed during this time.
Well, she say bad words under her breath or loudly for the class to hear it. Throws items on the floor like pencils, books, and classroom materials. Sometimes she will leave the classroom.
Okay, what do you mean by bad words?
She uses profanity such as F word, you, Mr. J, you are an A. I don't have to do this.
Mm-hmm. Are there any interventions in place?
When she starts cursing at me, I point to a visual reminder of using appropriate language and redirect her to pick up items off the floor.
All right, thank you. That's good details. How about rotation number 3, independent work?
I would rate that a 2. She is not likely to be disrupted when completing the independent activities.
Okay, good. How is Lucia at recess?
This is a 1. She enjoys recess.
Okay, great. When you return to the classroom for math rotations, how is Lucia's behavior?
Lucia really excels at math. I would rate this a 2. She is less likely to be disrupted, but might still say inappropriate phrases to other students during the computer rotation.
Okay, how about lunch and recess?
This is a 1. Lucia gets along well with peers and has no behavioral concerns at this time.
Okay, good. What do you know about Lucia's behavior during PE?
From talking to the PE teacher, this is her best time of day. She loves playing sports and working as a team. This would probably be a 1.
Okay, sounds good. I'll still check in with Mrs. L to confirm this. After PE, she returns to your SDC classroom for electives like science, art, or history. How is her behavior in that class?
I will say a 3. She mostly enjoys this part of the day because we do many hand-on projects and work with groups. If there is a reading component or a group member who is bothering her, I might observe her saying inappropriate words. But this does not escalate and is not a big concern.
Okay, great. And lastly, how would you rate Lucia's behavior during dismissal?
This will be a 1. Lucia does a great job cleaning up and following directions prior to going home for the day.
All right, this is great information. Thank you for your time. All right, next we'll focus on identifying student strengths. We look for at least 3 strengths or contributions to the school. What are Lucia's academic strengths or interests?
She excels at math, specifically addition, subtraction, and multiplication. She also enjoys drawing storyboards.
Great. How about some of Lucia's social or recreational activities?
Lucia has an amazing sense of humor. She loves to play with Legos and enjoys making domino trucks. She also enjoys working on a project with her friends.
Thank you. Do you know of any other strengths or interests that might be helpful for us to know about?
She also loves playing basketball and soccer and singing in the choir. I hear from recess supervisors and peers that she has a lot of energy and plays well on a team at recess.
This is great information about Lucia's strengths and interests that we can build on. Next, we need to define the problem behavior so it can be clearly observed and measured. Since you identified only the small group reading and writing routine as a 5 or a 6, we'll focus specifically on those behaviors during that time. For the rest of the interview, only think about what happens during small group reading and writing time in your SDC classroom.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, look at these behaviors listed here and identify any behaviors you see Lucia engage in during small group reading and writing time. I'll put an X next to each behavior you identify.
Well, I would say inappropriate language, verbal harassment, disrupted, and work not done.
Okay, are there any behaviors that are not listed here that you would also include?
Yes, she throws classroom materials on the floor, such as pencils, worksheets, books, and other reading materials from the group. She also elopes from the classroom and then runs around the building.
Okay, so I've checked the boxes for these behaviors and wrote the note next to other about throwing items and eloping. Now, please rank the behaviors according to your level of concern. For example, which behavior is most important to you that we address first in an intervention plan? Identify your number 1 and number 2.
This one is difficult because they occur often together. Eloping happens less frequently. So even though Lucia might leave the classroom, this is more on a weekly basis rather than a daily. I would say throwing items is the number 1. Concern and verbal harassment is number 2.
Okay, great. Now we want to get really specific in defining the behavior so I could observe it and take data. Define specifically what throwing items looks like.
Well, as I noted before, Lucia will throw classroom materials from the table onto the floor, such as pencils, worksheets, books, and other reading materials. She does not throw these at adults or students, though, just onto the floor.
Okay, that's a great definition. Now, define specifically what verbal harassment looks and sounds like. What are some things that Lucia says, and how does she say these?
She uses profanity directed at me, such as, F you, Mr. J, you're an a-hole. I don't have to effing do this. This is a stupid effing book. Sometimes single curses words are said under her breath. Often, she says these phrases loudly in the classroom, so that all of the other students can hear what she's saying. Verbal harassment also includes turning to her peers and saying, don't look at me, bitch, or you, suck, or don't touch me, shit, head, even when other students are not touching her.
Okay, great. Those are very specific examples that help us see how intense the behavior is at this point. Are there any other examples of verbal harassment or throwing that you'd like to share?
No, that's about it.
Okay. So, how frequently does Lucia engage in these behaviors during reading groups?
I'd say probably 10 times during the 30-minute reading group. This usually happens within the first couple of minutes.
Okay. And when she starts with the verbal harassment, how long do each of the incidents usually last?
Well, the verbal comments are brief, about 10 to 15 seconds. But these comments usually escalate for a longer incident of verbal harassment. Throwing items, not completing work. This is usually about 10 to 15 minutes out of the 30-minute small group time.
Okay. Would you say the behavior escalates?
Yes. On some occasions, the behavior will escalate from verbal harassment and throwing items on the floor to Lucia eloping from the classroom about once a week.
Okay. And would you say the behavior is a danger to herself or others?
No, it's not dangerous.
Okay. Now, we'll try to identify the triggers or predictors of Lucia's behaviors of verbal harassment and throwing items. Take a look at these common triggers or antecedents. Antecedents are events that happen immediately before a behavior occurs. Identify any you believe are triggers for Lucia's behavior at small group reading and writing time.
Okay, I'll say text too hard, small group work, and with peers.
Okay, so I've marked those items with an X. Is there anything else not listed that seems to trigger the behavior?
Every time I bring out the core curriculum materials during small group work, which is most days of the week, Lucia will be disrupted.
Great. I've noted that in the space for other. Now, could you rank order which of these you think is the strongest predictors or more likely to trigger the verbal harassment and throwing items?
Well, the core curriculum materials will be number 1. Small group work will be number 2. Probably tasks too hard, number 3.
Okay, that's interesting. I need a little more detail. So let's start with task too hard and core curriculum materials. Describe the task in a bit more detail.
Lucia does not like to read or write. She can read materials at the 4th grade level out loud, but responding to comprehension questions is challenging. Her independent comprehension level is more at the third grade reading curriculum.
Okay.
Along with vocabulary development, she can answer who, what, and where questions correctly. But why and how, more inferential questions, are challenging for her. The core curriculum materials, narrative or expository text and workbook we currently use are at the beginning of fifth grade. To reflect her current grades, she especially does not like to answer questions pertaining to texts that we read during small group instructions.
Interesting and very good details. Now, tell me about the small group setting.
Students sit with peers at a small table. There are 5 peers total at a kidney-shaped table working with me. We read texts together. Either I read out loud, students read orally, or I have them read independently. We practice reading strategies such as annotating and completing graphic organizers together. Then they work on answering comprehension on their own to start. After attempts to answer on their own, we discuss their learning.
Great details. Thank you. All right, so next we will look at consequences, or what Lucia seems to be getting out of the verbal harassment and throwing items. Look at this list of consequences and think about why Lucia is engaging in these behaviors. I will mark down any consequences you mention.
All right. Well, there seems to be a few consequences. She gets adult attention. She gets peer attention. She avoids hard task failure. She avoids undesired task activity.
Okay, so let's rank these consequences. Which do you think would be number 1 and number 2?
This is difficult because it could be about the same. Well, she definitely receives a lot of adult attention from me. So that could be number 1. She also avoids the undesired task activity of a small group reading and writing. So that could be number 2.
Okay, well, let's get some more details about these consequences to see what might be stronger. Whose attention is obtained?
Well, that will usually be mine as the adult leading the activity. Peers will also look at her during small group instructions and tell her to be quiet or get to work. But I don't think she cares as much about this.
Okay, so how is the attention provided?
Well, I usually redirect her to a visual that reminds her to use appropriate language. She also has a visual task card to remind her of what is expected during this small group rotation.
Great. Let's look at the avoid undesired task activity and describe this specifically.
Lucia really does not want to read or write. She complains that the book is too heavy, there are too many words, and that the writing is too long.
And what specifically is the work that is required?
This is especially when reading from the core curriculum book and writing in the core curriculum workbook.
Great. In addition to your redirection, how does Lucia avoid completing the work?
Well, she will use profanity at me when we begin the task, and I redirect her to visual cards. Then she usually throws the items on the floor. I will redirect her to pick up the items, which she will follow through. But then the sequence might repeat itself after a slow start to reading in the core curriculum book.
Okay. Is there anything else that happens at this time?
Yes, by about the second or third instance of these behaviors, I send her to take a break area.
Interesting. So after several minutes of verbal harassment, throwing items on the floor, and redirections from you, she is then sent away from the small group area to take a break?
Yes, that describes the typical sequence of these behaviors.
Okay. Would you say that Lucia avoids completing a lot of the reading and writing activities during this rotation?
Yes, that sounds about it.
Okay. Can Lucia perform these tasks independently?
No, not the tasks used in the core curriculum materials.
Okay. Is an academic assessment needed to identify specific skill deficits?
We recently completed evaluations for Lucia's triennial assessment, and I take data regularly on academics. As I noted earlier, she reads, comprehends, and writes independently using third grade curriculum materials.
Okay. So would you say that she has a skill deficit related to fifth grade reading level materials?
Yes, this seems to be a skill deficit.
Okay, great. Thank you for this detailed information. All right. The last section to go over is setting events. These are the things that happen outside of small group reading and writing time that might make Lucia's behaviors worse. Lucia might seem more agitated on different days, or you can tell that she just might be having a tough day. Setting events can be more difficult to identify because as teachers, we don't always know about things happening outside the classroom. So you may not even be sure, which is okay.
Fortunately, I have great communication with Lucia's mom, and we complete a feelings paper each day during our morning routine. Lucia usually indicates positive pictures and circles a happy emoji on the paper. On rougher mornings, she circles the mad emoji and might draw a picture with her mom or sister getting in trouble. Mom also texts me often that Lucia had a rough morning, did not sleep well the night before, and or when she fights with her younger sister.
Okay, that's a great way to learn about setting events from your students. Look through this list and identify setting events you think might be an issue with Lucia.
I would say lack of sleep, conflict at home, missed medication. Sometimes I'm not exactly sure either.
Okay, great. I marked those items with an X. Using your best judgment, can you rank order the setting events related to the behaviors that occur during small group reading and writing?
I would say conflict at home is number one, lack of sleep is number two, and missed medication is number three. That seems to be how often the settings events occur. Based on text from Lucia's mom and the feeling paper during morning's meetings.
Okay, this is great. And we are just about finished with the interview. Now I'm going to review your responses and form a summary of behavior. So give me a minute to review your interview. Okay, so this is what I hear you say. When Lucia sees the core curriculum text or workbook during small group reading and writing, Lucia will use profanity towards you, throw materials from the table to the floor, and sometimes elope from the classroom. As a result, you redirect the behaviors using verbal and visual reminders and then send Lucia to the take a break area. You believe these behaviors might be to gain your attention and avoid the undesired task of reading and writing. You identify conflicts at home and lack of sleep as setting events. Does this sound accurate? Or is there anything you might add or change?
That sounds pretty accurate. Though now that I think about it, Lucia ultimately gets out of doing the work and usually ends up in the take a break area. Even though she technically gets my attention immediately, I think she primarily engages in the behaviors to avoid the reading and writing task during a small group core curriculum time.
Yes, I would agree with that. It seems that she is really avoiding the task given the behaviors combined. The last thing we need to do is a confidence rating. Rate on the 6-point scale from not real sure to 100% sure how confident you are that the summary I just presented accurately explains Lucia's disruptive behaviors during small group reading and writing time, taking into the fact that we are thinking the function is more likely to escape the undesired activities.
Well, I've seen this behavior a lot. I'm pretty confident. I'd rather say 5 out of 6.
Okay, fantastic. That wraps up the interview. I really appreciate your time. I'll try to complete several observations of Lucia during small group reading and writing time before the end of this week. I'll also check in with Lucia's caregivers and complete an interview with Lucia herself. Then you'll be invited to a meeting to discuss Lucia's behavior and develop a behavior intervention plan. If you think of anything more you'd like to add, please let me know, and thank you again for this interview.
You're welcome.